But it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Morgan Richard, who is a postdoc at CEPA over at Stanford after graduating from UCL last year. She has worked in macro, sort of intersection of macro and spatial, with interest in housing, consumption, inequality, and wealth inequality. And today she's going to present her job market paper, The Spatial and Distributive Implications of Working from Home, a General Equilibrium Model. And I think we discussed it. Please feel free throughout the presentation to put your hand up or to put things in the chat. If Morgan doesn't see your comments, I will give her a heads up that people want to make comments throughout. So the format, formally is 40 minutes of presentation and then 20 minutes for Q&A. But we can be a bit flexible with that in terms of if there's some conversation that comes up throughout the talk. And then after the hour, sort of the formal recording will end. And if anyone wants to stay online to chat, that'd be great. So take it away.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. So let's just jump right in. That starts. In the recent years, we've radically changed how and where we work, following the widespread adoption of working from home. Here, I'm borrowing from the massive scale survey data from Barrow, Bloom, and Davis, and I'm plotting the percentage of paid full days that are done from home. It starts really low before the pandemic, around 7%, increases during COVID, and then comes back down to stabilize around 25–30% of paid full days. And it's been really stable, you can see it on the plot, since basically January 2021. So I think we can say that work from home is a persistent change in the way we do organize labor. Now this raises some issues. Workers might need more space to be productive at home, and they commute to the office less often. Besides, not all occupations are equal in front of working from home. It's a lot easier for us economists than it is for, let's say, nurses. So in this paper, I answer the following questions. How did work from home reshape households' housing demand? Should the workers who cannot work from home care about this at all? And how will work from home impact inequality in the short and in the longer run? To answer these questions, I start by providing some new motivational finding on the impact of work from home in London. I do have house prices and rent data that are very granular, so at the property level. And I have a lot of detailed characteristics about these properties. So I can use this rich data into some hedonic pricing schedule. Then I build a dynamic spatial heterogeneous agent model with remote work. And the goal of the model is to explore the consequences of work from home on households' housing decision, their spatial allocation inside the city, their welfare, and on consumption, housing, income, and liquid wealth inequality. So here, if I want to think about the rise in remote work, I need to take a stance on what changed. And in this project, I'll think about a permanent change in workers' preference for working from home. So first, the idea, it's quite simple. Before the pandemic, working from home was seen as a form of shirking. There was some social stigma associated with it. Then COVID hit, and we all had to try it. We realized that there's a lot to like. It's comfortable, you get to spend the day with your partner or with your pet. So there's been a positive shift in attitude towards working from home. Just this shift in attitude is also documented in Barrow, Bloom, and Davis survey of working attitude and arrangements. They have more than 30,000 respondents in the US for several waves. There are companion surveys in other countries. And for instance, these are questions that relate to this. So in the survey, participants are asked, how would you value the option to be able to remote work 2 or 3 days a week? And for more than 63% of the sample, they would see it as a pay rise. They're also asked, amongst the people that you know, how would you say the perception of work from home has changed? And for more than 65% of the respondents, it has improved. And finally, they asked, compared to your expectation, how would you say that work from home has turned out? And for roughly 60%, it has turned out better than expected. So there is this positive shift in attitude. Here, though, I want to be precise. I'm holding other margins constant, like technology for commuting or for working from home, amenities, occupational choices. Here, I am not saying that these margins are not important or that they didn't change. I just look at one particular aspect, this change in attitude, look at it cleanly in the model and see how far I can go with that. The last thing is about the time horizon. So I will think about it in the short and in the longer run. Here, by design, the empirical evidence that we have on remote work are informative of how the economy reacts in the short run. We do need a model to think about the longer run perspective. And here what I'm doing really is I try to bridge the gap between these two time horizons because I calibrate my change in preference using the observed work from home patterns in the short run, in the transition period. So I use the short run to calibrate and discipline the model, and then I use it to think about the longer run. Now, what will be the key ingredients of the model? So just as a reminder, the model's goal is to explore the consequences on inequality and on households. So the first thing I need is that work from home is interesting because it loosens the link between where people live and where people work. So I do need some measure of like spatial elements, some locations. As I told you, not all occupations are equal in front of remote work. So I will have different jobs where some workers can remote work, and those who can, they make endogenous work from home decisions. I will also need housing. So these houses will differ in their location to interact with the spatial element, their size, and their tenure. So here what I mean by tenure is if they're owned or rented. I will need that because if I want to think about housing wealth inequality, I need to keep track of the households who do not own any real estate wealth. I'm also adding two realistic features of the housing market. The first one is a financial friction. You do need a minimum down payment to buy a house. And the second one is if you want to sell your house, you do have to pay some adjustment cost. So this will be a fixed proportion of the house that you're selling. If I want to think about inequality, I also need to have some income and wealth heterogeneity. So this will enable the model to generate income and wealth distributions, which will interact with the financial friction of the minimum down payment and also the adjustment cost for sell a house. So this will enable the model to speak about housing affordability across the city. And just the main mechanism is super simple. House prices and rents are determined in general equilibrium in each of the model location. And so the endogenous work from home decision from part of the workforce will trickle down to the rest of the economy. So really quick preview of the results before we jump into it. So first of all, on the empirical motivational evidence, I find that since the rise in work from home, we have a change in London house prices. We have an increase by 5% in the premium for space. I'll define it a bit more carefully. And a 6% decline in the commuting penalty. So that is the penalty of being further away from the city center. In the model, I do find that we get a change in housing demand. House prices and rents increase everywhere across the city, but more so in the suburb. The suburb, is where the cheapest properties used to be. So this relative appreciation of suburban properties will lead to a crowding out of the marginal homeowners who will be pushed into renting. So you can think about it as gentrification that hits all the suburbs of London at the same time. And so, for instance, the home ownership rate of the workers who cannot remote work decreases by 4 percentage points in the long run, and the drop is fully concentrated in the suburb. This brings me to this last result, so the rise in a tele-premium, meaning some extra benefit for the workers employed in occupations where work from home is feasible. Inequality across occupations increase along several dimensions: income, consumption, liquid and housing wealth. And the workers who cannot work from home do experience welfare losses. So now if there is no question on the introduction, let's just jump right in. So on the motivational facts, I will use data on house prices and rents for the London travel to work area, which is the Greater London. I do have property level data that have house prices, rents, and very detailed housing characteristics. So I did get this data by merging 3 different data sets. The first one is His Majesty Land Registry price pay data, which is the universe of all the properties sold in the UK since 1995. And from this, I have the transaction price, the date, the address, and some very sparse characteristics. For rents, I use data from the CDRC, so the When Fresh Zoopla data, which is really all the properties ever listed to rent on Zoopla since 2012. And here as well, so I do have like the weekly rent, the address, but the characteristic on the properties are quite sparse. So to get to know a bit more on these properties themselves, I'm using the energy performance certificate dataset, which comes from a regulation in the UK. So I don't know if some of you are tuning in from there, but basically in the UK, for a house to be either rented or sold, it needs to have a valid EPC certificate. So it's an inspector coming to your house and logging in a bunch of very detailed characteristics. Of course, the size, the number of room, but also if it has double glazing, the energy efficiency, the type of building and whatnot. So on this, I also have the address. So I can do an address level merging to get the mapping between the universe of prices and the characteristics. Here, I think that work from home interacts with housing demand across two main dimensions of houses, their location and their size. So I will start by just showing you in the raw data two naive plots on these locations, and then we'll get a bit deeper in the analysis. So for the raw data exploration on the first characteristic, which is the proximity to the city center. Here in panel A, you have house prices, panel B, you have rent, and I'm plotting the growth between basically the last year of data available and the year right before COVID, on the log distance to the city center. And each dot is one of London local authority, so Camden, Hackney. And we do see here a clear positive relationship, meaning that since the rise in work from home, since the pandemic, the properties located further out have appreciated faster. Now, if we do this simple, very simple plot, but a kind of a placebo version, where I look at the growth not before now and right before COVID, but the growth between, let's say, 2017 and 2019, once again plotted on distance to the city center, we do see that this positive relationship is a lot less obvious. All right. So this is for location in the raw data. Let's look at now size as well in the raw data. So once again, house prices is panel A, rents is panel B. And here those are indices. So the baseline is February 2020, right before the pandemic. And I'm looking at different types of properties. So studios or 1 bed, 2, 3, 4, and larger houses. And here we also do see that the larger properties do appreciate faster. Now let's get into a little bit more details. I want to know basically how important are size and proximity to the city center in determining house prices and rents. And more importantly, did this change at all since the rise of working from home? So I will use some hedonic pricing schedule. Here the indices, so I is property I, J is the neighborhood, so Camden, Hackney, T is month, and I am regressing the log of house prices or rents on the log of size, the log of distance to the city center, and two interaction terms for size and distance, with it being after February 2020. I also have some property-specific controls, so the type of property, the energy efficiency, if it's a new build and whatnot, and some local authority fixed effect and time fixed effect. In this baseline specification, here are the results. So column 1, we have price being the dependent variable. Column 2, it's rent. And first, let's look at the non-interacted coefficients. So if we look at size, we do see some positive and significant coefficients, meaning that, well, larger properties are more expensive. We have a positive size gradient. This is intuitive. When we look at distance, on the other hand, we have negative coefficients, meaning that we have negative distance gradient, meaning that properties located further out are cheaper. This is also intuitive. Now let's look at the interacted coefficients. And we do see that for size and it being after February 2020, we do have some positive and significant coefficients. This means that the premium associated with space has risen. We have an increase, is steepening, let's say, in the size gradient. And if we think about how much it costs from upgrading your house from the median size to the 75th percentile, this size premium has increased by 5% between before and after February 2020. Now, if we look at distance, once again, we do see some positive and significant coefficients. And here it means that the penalty associated with being further out has decreased. We have a flattening of the distance gradient. And to think about it, like the distance penalty of the average house in the suburb compared to the center has decreased by 6% over the period. So now if we do a same, like a
Can
kind
I
of
just ask
simple...
a quick question?
Yes, of course.
Just to fix ideas a bit for those, I think most people know London's geography, but there's sort of that one point that's, you know, at the city centre in your plots, and then there's another point that's about one log unit further out. Just feel like in terms of geography, like what ring are we thinking there?
Okay, so it's about like, so right now what I'm using for the city centre is Bank of England, which is at the heart of the city, which is the business district in London. I also like played around with like Chancery Lane or other points that are usually used if we think about London as a monocentric city. I also looked at, so there is this new work that is done by Fabien Postel-Vinet and Monica Costadia, and they also look at the distribution of the jobs and the geography in London. We do have more density in this center part, but if I'm really being super frank with you, there is another part of London, which is at the east in Stratford, where we do also have the emergence of a business district at this point. Here, in this current version, I do use it as a monocentric city, but I am thinking about in the revision using some gravity model to have a little bit more this dual center taken into this motivational fact. But right now I'm being extremely simple.
Okay, so one log unit of distance. So like when you say suburbs versus the city centre, is that like which zone on the tube type thing?
So here I do have basically, it's a log, so it's 1% more distance is like increasing the price by 0.07%. In the plot that I showed you, it was in the plot, so this is the log distance to the city center. So basically, I think here we're talking about 20 kilometers, which is roughly like zone 1 and 2 of the London Underground.
Okay, cool.
And then it goes really far. But in the model, I'll have 2 regions, and the center will be zone 1 and 2 of the Underground. All right.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sorry, I didn't get your question the first time. All right, just as to fix ideas as well, I'm also doing this kind of regression in a placebo setting where I call the pre-COVID period 16-17 and the post-COVID 18-19. And we do see that the non-interacted term have the same magnitude, same significance, but the interaction term just drop out. All right, so now what have I done here? I just showed you some motivational evidence. We have a rise in the premium for space, a decline in the commuting penalty, but we do need a model if we want to draw a direct link between this and remote work, and also think about, is this really a change in housing demand? And most importantly, I will need the model to explore the consequences for the households who live in the city. So I want to think about inequality, so in terms of like consumption, housing wealth, liquid wealth, income, but also across different types of population, so throughout the economy, but also by housing tenure, by occupation. I want to look at the shorter, the longer run, and also think about policy and welfare. So I really do need a model for this. This will be a general equilibrium model, as I've hinted, where the city, as we were saying, is made of 2 locations, a center and a periphery. Here I am assuming that all the jobs are in the center, and these locations do differ in their amenities, commuting costs, land, and housing supply elasticities. Households in this economy do derive utility from non-durable consumption as well as from housing, and they can either own their house or rent it. Some workers will be employed in occupations where work from home is possible. So there will be, let's say, the economist of the model, and these workers allocate their hours between work that's done at the office, where they're more productive, but they have to pay a commuting cost, and work that is done at home, where they don't commute, but they have to set aside part of their housing space as home office. Just to fix ideas, households are heterogeneous in terms of their income, liquid wealth, housing wealth, where they live, and their occupation. Okay, so this is a bit of a naive representation of the city. So think about the center as zone 1 and 2 of the London Underground, the suburb beyond. All the jobs are in the center. If you are a worker living in the suburb, you either work from home from there or do a long commute to the office. If you live in a center, you either work from home from there or do a short commute to the office. The idea is that the amount of space is fixed, and so households' endogenous Well, the endogenous work from home decision from part of the workforce only will trickle down to the rest of the economy by general equilibrium. I will not show you the entire model. I will simply show you 3 different aspects that are key and allude to the rest. The first thing that I will show you is household's utility function. I will start by showing it without work from home, and then in the next slide, I'll show where it enters. So if we have in the baseline no remote work version, this is the utility of household I, employed in occupation K, living in location J, center or periphery. It is made of 2 blocks. The first one, it's a Cobb-Douglas CRA of non-durable consumption and housing services. And here, basically, the housing services, if you're a renter, it is just equal to the house that you have, the size of your house. But if you are a homeowner, you have this extra term, omega, in front of it, and this is greater than 1. So this is some extra utility from owning. You like being at home. And then we do have this second part, which is about where you live. So epsilon j upper bar, these are the amenities in a given location that are valued the same by everybody. And then we have this last part, which is some location-specific taste shifter that follows a Gumbel distribution. And here you can think about it as households' tastes for the amenities of a given location. So this is household-specific and changes over time. So this is the baseline. Now, if we add work from home, it will enter at 2 different places. The first one, directly here, which is the preference for working from home. So NH is hours spent working from home, and eta is this preference parameter. It is a constant. And it is what I'm going to change in the remote work experiment. So think about a low eta as there is a high social stigma with working from home, and a high eta as it being, ooh, I get to spend the whole day with my cat. Now, work from home also enters in how much you do value your house. Basically, let's look at the renter. So you like your house by its size, minus some discount alpha of H under bar if you work from home. H under bar, I'll come back to this in a couple slides, it's the amount of space that you use in working at home. And basically, it's the idea that if you work from home, you set up your monitor, your desk chair, and then your living room is a little bit crowded, you can't really do your yoga there anymore, so consequently, you do like it a little less. Then how much you like the neighborhood is exactly the same. All right, so this is for the preference. The second thing that I will show you is the labor choices. So we do have a household that there is no leisure in the model, but it's a household who has 1 unit of time and splits the hours between NH, hours spent working from home, and NO, hours spent working from the office. When you work from the office, you do have to commute. All the commuting costs will be in terms of time, and this is this Xi parameter. It depends on where you live. Short commute for the center, long commute for the suburb. If you do work from the office, you create N tilde O, which is efficient unit of labor from the office. Here, the specification, so you have this AO parameter, which is the common productivity for everybody at the office. And then you have this new IT, which is your idiosyncratic productivity shock. This is worker specific, follows a Markov process. Then you have NO, hours spent working from the office, and theta, which is the weight of labor in this production function. Now you can also work from home. So if you work from home, you create efficient unit of labor from home N tilde H. The specification is somehow similar. So you have this AH parameter, which is once again about the common productivity of everybody at home. But here you see that it has a subscript K. So it is occupation specific. Actually, it's really simple. It's equal to 0 if you can't remote work, otherwise it is a constant. Then your idiosyncratic productivity, new IT, is the same as if you were working from office. NH is hours that you spend working from home. And then we have this extra term, H under bar, that we saw in the utility function. And this is about the space you need. So the idea is a constant. And the idea is that to be productive at home, you need to have a desk space, an office. If you don't have it, you can't produce. But if your house is much larger than this, you won't be much more productive. So this is this minimum, this necessary and sufficient amount of space that you do need. Then the workers do create overall efficient unit of labor by aggregating efficient unit of labor from home and from office in a CES. And I am modeling it this way because there is some evidence in the microliterature that tasks done from home and from office are imperfect substitutes. This will enable me to get there. And finally, I get the workers paid WT per efficient unit of labor that they do supply. So this is the part on the labor. And the last thing that I will show you is the housing. So basically, quite standard. You can decide if you want to own your house or if you want to rent it. House prices and rents are determined in equilibrium, so they will be location specific. As I told you, if you own your house, you get some extra utility because you like being at home. However, if you do own your house, you have to pay for maintenance. It's compulsory and you offset depreciation. If you're a renter, you don't have to pay for it directly, but it will enter basically in the rent. And here, this is the important bit. So if you are a homeowner and want to sell your house, you need to pay some transaction cost. That is a fixed share, FSEL, of the value of the house that you're selling. The renter gets a lot more flexibility. There are other assets in the model. Everybody can save in a risk-free, low-return asset. And uncollateralized borrowing is not allowed. So if you want to borrow, it is against the collateral. And we have, as I told you, a minimum down payment friction. I will gloss over the supply side. Well, we do have a final good producer with a very simple technology pinning down the wages. Then there are new houses that are built in each location by a construction sector. And they use a Cobb-Douglas technology with two different inputs, labor, which is flexible, and the fixed input, which is an amount of land permits. These land permits are owned by the government, which capture all the profits from this construction sector. And then we also have some rental companies in each location that are perfectly competitive. And at the end of the day, the rents will be some user cost formula of house prices. I'm happy to come back into this a bit later if there are some questions. All right, so this model, I have to solve it numerically because it is quite a complex model. First of all, it's big. I have 6 different state variables, 7 different choices, but also I get a lot of non-convexities. The adjustment cost bring a lot of non-convexities, and I also have a lot of discrete choices. Will you buy, will you sell, will you rent, will you keep? So my value function has a lot of kinks. It's not just nicely concave, and I have to make sure that each optimum is not just a local maximum. So it does require, I'm using basically a mixture of these two techniques, the Druidal nested endogenous grid point and the discrete continuous EGM with taste shock. The parameterization strategy that I use is quite straightforward. It's mixed. A set of parameters is fixed from the literature. So for instance, the elasticity of substitution between the task done from home and from the office. A set of parameters I do calibrate to match moments, but outside the model. This is what I do, for instance, with the occupation-specific income processes. And the remaining of the parameters are jointly calibrated with the method of simulated moments inside the model. Here, I do not want to, I don't have time to dwell on it, get into too much detail, sorry, on the parameterization, but I'm happy to talk about this once we will have done the result, if there are questions. There is one thing that I want to show you before we get to the, before we do get to the work from home experiment. It is the policy function, because I think they're quite informative of how the model works. So here I'm plotting a policy function that is the probability to choose to live in the center. It is a probability because we do have a Gumbel shock. And then I'm plotting it on liquid wealth, and the other states are held fixed. So it's a household who can remote work, starts the period with median income, and then starts the period without owning any real estate wealth. And here, when we look at it, it looks a little bit odd. So let me walk you through it. The center basically is nice because you have shorter commutes and more amenities. However, it's more expensive. So here, the richer you will be, the more likely you are to get there. And then we get to a kink at this point. And this is the point where the household would become wealthy enough to buy a house in the suburb, but would remain a renter in the center. So the relative attractiveness of the center decreases. Then we do have another kink here, which is the point where the household would be wealthy enough to buy even in the center. So the full attractiveness of the center is restored and the slope steepens. Now, so this is the policy function for a household who starts without owning. What about the household who starts owning a house? So this is the same probability to choose to live in a center on liquid wealth. It's a household who can remote work, has median income, and the value of the house they own is median. And here, because the house needs to be somewhere, I will have 2 different policy functions. One if the house used to be in the center in blue, and one if the house is in the center in orange. And here what we do see well, first of all, as a sanity check. So if you own the house in the center, well, you're more likely to stay in the center than if you were owning in the suburb. And this is the case because if you own in the suburb, you would have to sell your house. Here, I just want to flag something that is quite fundamental in this policy function. It is about the wedge between the two policy functions. This wedge is very large for low levels of liquid wealth. And this is the case because for the orange household, as I said, they will need to sell their house. Selling is costly because you have to pay for this transaction cost. But by the shape of this cost, their fixed share of the value of the house you sell, they will be particularly biting for low wealth households. So this is why at low levels of liquid wealth, we have an extra deterrence of this adjustment cost. And this is why we have such a big wedge. We have an interaction between the adjustment cost, their shape, and the wealth distribution. And this will be important when we'll think about welfare later on. All right. So now there is no question on the model itself. Let's get into the policy experiment. Oh, sorry, the work from home experiment.
Sorry, Morgan, I actually had a question on amenities. So you said we like the city center because there are more amenities, but this is partly endogenous. So here you're kind of assuming that this is given. So the question is whether you would have some moments in your data or to kind of identify or test for this.
So actually, I misexpressed myself, Isabelle, because I'm using it in the estimation, well, calibration strategy. So I basically take the amenities in the center in order to match the price per square meter, the ratio of price per square meter between the suburb and the center. So to get like the price per square meter in the suburb to be only 62% of what it is in the center, I do need to get some extra amenities in the center. And this is how I basically calibrate this. However, I do agree that in this particular specification, this is completely constant. So I will not change it when I think about the rise in work from home. And this is potentially an important mechanism later on. So if the cities do transform, the amenities might move around. And I play around exogenously a little bit with this model, but I think I want to also do an extension with endogenous amenities. Did this answer your question? Okay. All right, so now let's get to the work from home experiment. So as I mentioned, I'm going to change the ETA parameter, workers' preference for working from home. Now, how do I calibrate it? Well, I have to calibrate it first in the baseline economy. So in the baseline economy, I calibrate, the economy before COVID, so 2019. I'm using a wave of the UK Time Use Survey. And the moment that I target will be for the households in occupation where work from home is feasible, how much work they do from home. It used to be 15%. Now, how do I calibrate my change in preference? Well, I am calibrating it over the transition period. So it means that I'm using the last wave of the UK Time Use Survey, which is at the end of 2021. And I do see that at this time, these households who can remote work, they spend roughly 2.5 days a week at home. And here, this moment, at basically T+2 after the shock, is on the transition path. So calibrating on this will be computationally very costly because to do so, to get this moment in the model, I need to solve for the baseline steady state, compute this large object that is the joint distribution of households across this 6-dimensional state space. I need to solve for the steady state once the economy will have reached the new steady state, so get the joint distribution there, and then non-linearly solve for the entire transition period, get the distribution at each time, and make sure that the model the house price is clear at each time. So computationally, it's really costly, but it's important because the evidence that I have is in the short run. So I need to take into account the fact that we are in the transition period. So this is what I'm doing in this exercise. The first thing that I do, just
in the States, and I presume elsewhere too, whether you work from home is, I think, in part about a preference, but I think it's largely about the firm policies. And I don't think that plays a role here, right? It's a preference shock that's adjusting the work from home.
Yes and no. So basically, yes, absolutely. This change comes from a preference shock, but you can think about it. At the end of the day, the workers, I showed you the labor problem, they're paid per overall efficient unit of labor that they do supply. So what they want as well is to maximize basically their output. So you could think about it as it's the firm policy and the workers do own the firm. If that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so there's some consistency there.
Yes, they are. But it's true that the change that I make the change come from the preference and not from like the relaxing this firm policy.
Okay. Or an adjustment in efficiency.
Yes, exactly. But if I were to, so there are some papers that think about it as like they do increase, basically they want to target this short run moment by increasing the relative productivity of remote work. This is, for instance, what's done in the Davis, Ghent, and Gregory. But basically in my setting, because I don't have really this urban approach, but a more macro approach, I didn't model the agglomeration externality from working together at the office. So if
Okay.
I go this route, I overestimate the output gains because I don't have this counterbalancing force. So I did play around, and in my model, this is the most parsimonious way that makes sense, at least in the current framework. All right, so let's get into the result now in the last like roughly 10 minutes. So first of all, we do have a change in housing demand. House prices increase everywhere across in the city. So you have in panel A in the center, in panel B in the suburb, but they do increase more in the suburb. So this is consistent with this increase in the demand for space and this decrease in the commuting penalty. If I look at the ratio of house prices suburb over center, this change is the same as what we see in the data. Here, what happens? Well, it's really simple. The workers who can work from home, now they will spend a larger share of their total time working at home. Consequently, they need more space, and houses are cheaper in the suburbs, so they do move out. Now, how can they afford this increase in housing demand, these larger houses? Well, they're saving on the commuting cost, so they do supply more labor. At T+2, we do have an increase in output of 2.7%, which would, Jessie, if we were circling back to the answer I just gave you, if I was changing the relative productivity, we would get to like 19% output gains, which is highly counterfactual. Now, this is the same plot, but I want to draw your attention on the shape of this plot, the speed. You see in the center, it takes quite a while for the price to reach the new steady state value, whereas in the suburb, it increases in the period following the shock. Why is it the case? Well, because of the composition of the new movers. So let me explain. Before the rise in work from home, we do have some workers who cannot work from home, who own properties in the suburb. They see this increase in housing demand coming from wealthy telecommuters, and the share of this household will sell their house, realize capital gains, and move to the center. However, because the relative house prices are so different across the two locations, the capital gains will not be enough for this household to buy a house right away. They will need to become renters for a while, accumulate liquid wealth, and then if they have not been hit by too many bad idiosyncratic shock, they will eventually buy a house. So the housing demand takes some time to materialize in the center, so house prices take some time to increase. On the other hand, who moves to the suburb? The wealthy telecommuters. They move because they want to buy. They want to buy big and they want to buy now, and they're wealthy enough to do so. So the housing demand in the suburb increases right away and prices follow right away. This leads me to this suburb-wide gentrification. So the workers who cannot work from home, they are at the bottom of the income and wealth distributions. And they tend to either, well, basically rent their house, or if they get to buy in the suburb. So this relative appreciation of the suburb crowds them out of homeownership. In the long run, their homeownership rate decreases by 4 percentage points, and the drop is fully concentrated in the suburb. Another illustration of this is to think about the marginal buyer. So that is in the group of the household who can't remote work, the household who will buy a house with a positive probability and wouldn't with a little lower income or a little lower wealth. I find this household in the baseline economy. This household buys a house in the suburb with probability 49 and otherwise rents in the center. I change the preference, solve the economy again, and I look at this exact same household. And I do see that it's been crowded out of homeownership. Now it rents either in the center or in the suburb. This brings me to this tele-premium, so this extra benefit for the workers who can remote work. Here I am plotting basically across different dimensions. So in this table, you have the average, let's say, consumption of the workers who can remote work over that of the workers who cannot. And it is in the baseline economy before the rise in remote work, and then in the long run after the rise in remote work. And we do see that these inequality increase across all dimensions. For instance, it's stark in housing wealth. So the average housing wealth of the telecommuters used to be twice as large as those of the non-telecommuters. And in the long run, it will be 2.5 times as large now. So, okay, inequalities increase, but what happens really for each group? If we think about the workers who can work from home, I have changed their preference over this little exercise. Their ETA has changed, so I can't really make, at the moment, any utility-based welfare measure. However, what do I know? I know that they have on average, their income, consumption, liquid, and housing wealth has increased. It's true for the average, actually, but it's also true over the distribution. So here, for instance, this is the telecommuters' consumption distributions, in blue in the baseline economy, and in orange in the longer run. And we see that the distribution shifts towards the right. So if we look at wealth, it looks very similar. So they have a little bit higher of everything on average, but also throughout the distribution. It's safe to assume that they're better off. However, for the workers who cannot work from home, it's a lot more ambiguous. The average liquid wealth is a little higher because housing is more expensive, they save more. They have a little higher income on average because some of them, as I told you, move to the center, and so like a save on commuting cost. But they have lower average consumption and much lower average housing wealth. However, for these households, they never had the opportunity to remote work. So basically, this ETA parameter was never in their utility function. So their preference haven't changed throughout this entire experiment. So I can make some utility-based welfare measure on this particular group. And this is what I'm doing here, where I'm plotting these non-telecommuters' welfare in compensating consumption variation. So this is basically how much consumption should you be given for you to be indifferent towards a rise in remote work. And these are expressed in percentage of current consumption. And basically, all these positive numbers indicate welfare losses because you will need to be compensated for you to be indifferent towards remote work. And we do see that on average, these non-telecommuters do experience welfare losses. The largest losses are incurred by the renters, as higher rents decrease resources available for consumption and savings, and higher house prices make accessing homeownership harder. Here, however, there is something quite surprising, is that on average, the homeowners also experience welfare losses. This is true even if the value of their asset has increased. So why is it the case? Well, first of all, the household who sold their house and moved to the center, of course, they did experience welfare gains, but the average homeowner did not. And why is it the case? Well, there are two channels and one mitigating factor. So first of all, house prices and rents increased everywhere across the city. So now if they're hit by a global shock and need to move, they need to live somewhere. So it will get a lot more expensive. They have reduced flexibility. This is decreasing welfare. The second thing is that higher house prices make maintenance costs more expensive. It increases the user cost of housing because maintenance is a proportion of house prices. At the moment, I'm also experimenting without this. Well, I'm working on the estimation of the model. So this is very much work in progress, but I'm also, in the previous version, I also experimented without this channel. The sign of the welfare wouldn't change, but the magnitude would be smaller. And the last part, which is about this mitigating factor, yes, they did experience capital gains, but for them to benefit from these capital gains, to cash them in, they need to sell. And selling is costly. And as we saw on the policy function, selling is particularly costly because of the shape of these adjustment costs, this fixed shape, for the low-income, low-wealth households who are overrepresented amongst the non-remote workers. So once again, here we have the interaction between the adjustment cost shape and the wealth distribution. The last thing that I want to show you in the last minute is a policy experiment. So now I did want to use the model to think about policy. I haven't modeled the commercial real estate properly, but there is a kind of a reduced form policy that we can do, is saying what would happen if we were alleviating the regulations against offices to apartment conversions in the city center. And a reduced form way to think about it in the model is to increase by, let's say, 5% the amount of loan permits issued by the government in the city center. Here we do see that house prices and rents would decrease in the center. They would still increase in the suburb, but by only half of what they do without the policy experiment. We have more households who can't remote work located back to the center, plus half a point compared to the baseline. But what's important is that these households, they get to buy. So the share of non-telecommuters who own a house in the center is 2 percentage points higher with the policy. Finally, I recomputed the welfare. So in the first column, you have the welfare losses in the baseline experiment. And in the second column, you do have it, oh, apologies. Well, sorry, this is bad. But yeah, you have it with the policy. And we do see that the welfare losses are significantly reduced. This brings me to my conclusion. So I did show you some motivational facts that work from home. We do have a change in London house prices with the increase in the premium for space, the decline in the commuting penalty. I used the model to think about really households and housing demand. I see some gentrification hitting all of the suburbs of London at the same time, the rise of some tele-premium and some welfare losses for the workers who cannot work from home. Some policies like office to apartment conversions can help with these welfare losses. And just to touch on some comments that were made earlier, there are two important channels, I think, that I completely abstract from in this current version. The first one is right now, I would like to add some occupation choices that are endogenous, because if remote work is an amenity, it means that in the long run, workers' occupation choice will be impacted by it. So I would like to have this in, and also have a bit of a more detailed demand for labor on the firm side, with firms asking for tasks that could be done from anywhere and tasks that need to be done at the office, and see if the workers will need to be paid a premium in the long run to come work. But this is another project. This is a bigger one this is too large as an addition for this one. And another part is what we mentioned with Isabelle. So I would like to think about if the workers who can remote work are at the top of the income and wealth distribution, and if they move out, it means that the composition of the neighborhood is changing. So the demand for locally consumed goods and services will also change. So I'd like to think about how the amenities move around the city endogenously and compute the welfare implication for the displaced occupations. And this is it for me.